Some names in legend inspire awe, others, sorrow. And then there are names that still carry the weight of betrayal, echoing through the centuries like a wound that never quite healed. Mordred is one of those names. His story isn't one of gallant quests or noble sacrifice. He wasn't the brightest star in Arthur's court, nor the most beloved among the knights of the Round Table. You won't find many songs sung in his honor, no shining poems, no stained glass tributes. But his role, his choices left a scar on Camelot that no tale of glory could ever erase. He was both kin and enemy, a knight and a traitor, a man shaped by fate but also shattered by it. This is the story of Sir Modred, the traitor knight, the one who shattered Camelot and brought down King Arthur himself. Mordred's beginning was already complicated before he ever took a breath. He wasn't born of love or even hatred. He was born of a secret, a mistake, a moment between two strangers that should have meant nothing and ended up meaning everything. Arthur, newly crowned, fresh from battle and not yet hardened by the burden of kingship, met Morgause in the haze of victory and wine. He didn't know she was his half-sister, and she didn't tell him. The boy that came from that night was never supposed to exist, not if fate had its way. When Merlin saw the threads of the future begin to knot, he brought Arthur a warning that a child born that year would be the death of Camelot. Not just a threat to the throne, but the one who would bring it down altogether. Arthur's answer was cruel, desperate, and soaked in fear. He ordered all the newborns born on the 1st of May to be gathered and sent out to sea, thinking that if he killed the right child, he could change the future. But fate has a way of slipping through cracks. The ship carrying those children sank, but not before Mordred was taken in secret and hidden away. Some say it was pirates who rescued him. Others believe it was the magic of Avalon, but most agree that he was eventually returned to Orkney, raised not by strangers, but by his mother. And there, in the cold, windswept north, Mordred grew up with a truth most children never have to face, that he was born of sin, abandoned by his father, and burdened with a prophecy before he ever had a chance to live. He wasn't alone. Morgause had other sons, Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Gareth, all older, all louder, all more admired. They trained together, fought together, and were bound by blood, but Mordred never really fit. His brothers burned hot and fast, filled with the fire of youth and honor. Mordred, on the other hand, burned slow, quiet, controlled. He was always watching, always listening, always trying to understand why his place in the world felt slightly off, no matter where he stood. Eventually, the pull of Camelot came for them all, Gawain with his hero's heart, Agravain with his sharp tongue, and Mordred with questions in his heart no one dared ask. He came to Arthur's court not as a villain, not even as a rival, but as a boy looking for a father who had nearly drowned him before he could crawl. Arthur didn't know what to make of him at first. He recognized the name, maybe even the face. But the past had been buried deep, and the king had long since stopped listening to prophecies. Mordred was allowed in, given a seat at the Round Table, a sword, and a place. But a place is not the same as belonging, and Mordred never forgot that. Mordred didn't shine like some of the other knights. He didn't carry the glow of Galahad's purity or the magnetic charm of Lancelot's presence. His strength wasn't in the way he looked, but in how people reacted when he entered a room. He was the kind of man who made others glance twice, not because he demanded attention, but because there was something unsettling about how still he was, like a wolf waiting for something to move. He was dark-haired, slim but strong, and always carried himself with a quiet, deliberate control. His features were sharp, hawk-like, some said, and his eyes a deep gray, almost cold. They didn't sparkle or soften. They watched. And if he smiled, it was rarely out of joy. More often, it was a reflex, a shield, something to put others at ease while he calculated everything they said. Mordred wasn't loud, and he didn't boast. He didn't need to. There was something about him that made people pay attention without realizing it. He could sit silently at a table full of knights, barely say a word, and still walk away with the upper hand. He knew how to listen, how to pick up on what wasn't being said. And he remembered everything. He trained like the rest of them, sword, shield, horseback, the whole lot, and he was more than capable in a fight. Not the strongest, not the flashiest, but smart. He knew when to strike and when to wait. He was fast, efficient, and precise. In tournaments, he rarely made it to the final rounds, but not because he lacked the skill. He didn't care to put on a show. Mordred's greatest weapon, though, wasn't anything you could hold in your hand. It was his mind. While others were caught up in the glory of quests or the romance of chivalry, Mordred saw the cracks. He noticed who was aligned with whom, which knights were favored, and which could be swayed. He understood that Camelot, for all its ideals, was still a court. And courts were built on perception, politics, and power. That's what made him dangerous. He wasn't a villain in the usual sense. He wasn't mad or cruel for the sake of it. What set him apart was that he understood how the world worked, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He didn't chase purity or divine approval. He chased what could be seen, touched, held. Influence, leverage, truth, even if it was uncomfortable. And he had something few others did, knowledge of his own origin. Mordred knew the secret that Arthur had tried to bury. He knew he was the son of the king and the king's half-sister. He knew he was a walking curse, prophesied to end the very kingdom he served. And instead of running from that fate, he kept it close, carried it like a second sword. He didn't want to destroy Camelot, but he never really believed it could last either. When the call went out for the Knights of the Round Table to search for the Holy Grail, it was more than just another quest. It was a reckoning. The Grail wasn't a trophy or a title. It was a test of the soul. For the pure-hearted, it offered divine purpose. For the rest, it became a mirror, one that didn't lie. Mordred answered the call like the others, though few seemed to notice. He wasn't among those expected to succeed. He wasn't Galahad, born of miracle and destined for greatness. He wasn't Percival, young and wide-eyed with wonder, and he certainly wasn't Lancelot, caught between sainthood and sin. Mordred wasn't the sort men told stories about when speaking of holy things. So why did he go? That question lingered long after he returned. Some believed he joined the quest out of duty, not desire. Others whispered that he only went so he wouldn't stand apart, wouldn't draw suspicion. But the truth, if Mordred would have ever admitted it, was simpler than all that. He went because he wanted to understand what the Grail really was. Not what the priests said, not what the songs claimed, but what it truly meant to those who chased it, and why they were willing to tear themselves apart in the process. Mordred's journey wasn't filled with visions or miracles. There were no angelic signs, no glowing chalices hovering in shafts of light. What he found instead were ruins, hermits, riddles, and echoes. He fought bandits, crossed desolate lands, and sat beside old monks who spoke in riddles and offered him bread without answers. One tale says he came upon a chapel deep in the forest, with vines curling through its stonework and a single chalice resting on the altar. It looked plain, simple. He approached, knelt, reached out, but as his fingers brushed its surface, it turned to ash. Another story tells of a woman clad in white who offered him wine from a silver cup. The moment he took it, she vanished, and the cup with her. Whatever truth lies behind those stories, one thing was clear. Mordred returned empty-handed, just like most of the others. But unlike the others, he didn't seem disappointed. He didn't speak of the Grail when he came back. He didn't sit in the great hall swapping tales or lamenting his failure. He simply returned to his place at the edge of Camelot, watched the court resume its usual dance, and said nothing. What he had seen, whatever it was, he kept to himself. If the Grail had tested him, he passed in his own way, not by proving his purity, but by facing the truth of who he was and what he wasn't. And that was enough. Because while others returned chasing redemption or meaning, Mordred came back with a clearer understanding. Camelot did not run on miracles. It ran on people, and people could be broken. After the Grail quest, Camelot was quieter, but not in the way a place finds peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes after disappointment, when too many had set out hoping for glory and returned with nothing. Some never came back at all. The Round Table, once a symbol of unity and purpose, now had empty seats and restless whispers. Mordred didn't make a show of his return. He didn't parade through the gates or speak of false humility. He just slipped back into the court, into the routine, into his role. But things had changed, not just in Camelot but in him. He no longer watched from the fringes. He listened more carefully, spoke more deliberately, and when others were still reeling from failure, Mordred seemed oddly composed, like someone who had expected the disillusionment long before it arrived. Arthur, for all his wisdom, had a blind spot when it came to those close to him. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps the hope that trust could heal old wounds. Whatever the reason, the king began placing more responsibility in Mordred's hands. Small things at first, overseeing disputes, managing castle affairs, speaking on the king's behalf when Arthur was away on short hunts or meetings with foreign dignitaries. And Mordred handled it all with care. He wasn't brash, he wasn't showy. He ruled with a quiet confidence that some found refreshing and others found deeply unsettling. He spoke with calm authority, as though he had been born to it. When he passed judgment, he did so quickly and cleanly, fair but never soft. The older knights, those who had ridden with Arthur since the early days, watched him with wary eyes. They remembered the prophecy. They remembered the bloodline. They remembered the day Arthur left Mordred alive when others whispered he should not have. But they said nothing. Not yet. The younger knights, the squires grown into warriors, saw something different. Mordred spoke plainly. He didn't lecture. He didn't pretend to be holier than the rest of them. And he listened. To the common soldiers, to the farmers who brought complaints, to the lesser lords who often went ignored. Some of them began to look to him the way they once looked to Arthur. And Mordred noticed. He started making changes, subtle ones. He supported reforms that made him popular with the people, lightened the burdens on small landholders, promoted a few lesser-known knights who had proven themselves in the field, not just in court. None of it threatened Arthur's rule directly. If anything, it made the kingdom appear more balanced, more just. But it also made Mordred look like the kind of leader who might be ready for more. He never spoke against the king. He never challenged Arthur publicly, but he didn't need to. His presence said enough. He stood just a little taller now. He smiled a little less. And when he addressed the court, he did so like someone who belonged at the center of it, not on the edges. Even Guinevere, sharp as ever, began to take notice. Some say she warned Arthur. Others say she simply watched, waiting to see how far things would go. Either way, a current had begun to shift beneath Camelot, slow but steady. A quiet rise that no one could quite stop, and few even dared to name. Mordred had learned something from his failures. Power wasn't taken in a single moment. It was built, layer by layer, until by the time people realized it was no longer in the hands of the rightful king, it was already too late. Camelot had seen betrayals before. Rebellions, jealousies, broken vows. These were not new to Arthur's court. But what was about to unfold cut deeper than any sword. Because this one came not from an enemy at the gate, but from the heart of the kingdom itself. And it started with a glance. Mordred wasn't the first to notice the closeness between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. Whispers had drifted through the court for years. A late-night conversation here, an affectionate gesture there. But most dismissed it, chalked it up to loyalty, to friendship, to two noble souls bound by the pressures of royal life. Mordred did not dismiss it. He watched. He noted when Lancelot's gaze lingered too long, when Guinevere's smile softened in ways it didn't for others. He noticed when servants were dismissed early, when Lancelot passed by the queen's chambers too often for it to be coincidence. And he said nothing. At least not at first. He was careful, calculated. He collected moments the way a falcon waits for a break in the wind. And when the time came, he didn't shout accusations in court or demand justice outright. That would have been foolish. No, Mordred let the court draw its own conclusions. He fed the right rumors to the right people. A well-timed smirk, a whispered comment to a loose-lipped noble. The flame of suspicion didn't take much to catch. All it needed was air, and Mordred gave it breath. The court buzzed, and when the murmurs reached Arthur, Mordred was already prepared. He came forward with carefully arranged witnesses, men who claimed to have seen the Queen and Lancelot in compromising moments, servants who swore their silence had been bought with gold or favors. It was enough to raise doubt, enough to crack the image of the Queen's virtue and Lancelot's loyalty. Arthur didn't want to believe it. He had loved them both, one as wife, the other as brother in arms. But the evidence, poisoned as it was, stacked too high. And Mordred made sure the king understood what it meant, not just as a man but as a ruler. The law was clear. Adultery with the Queen was high treason, and even Arthur, grieving, wounded, couldn't ignore his own code. Guinevere was arrested, sentenced to burn. The Queen of Camelot would die in the very court she once ruled. But fate, as always, had other plans. Lancelot returned, drawn by love or perhaps guilt. He came not to argue, but to act. With sword in hand, he stormed the execution grounds, cutting down those who stood in his way. Knights loyal to Arthur, some of them old friends, fell beneath his blade. Blood stained the soil where the Queen's pyre had stood. He saved Guinevere, but in doing so, he broke Camelot. The court erupted, loyalties fractured, brothers in arms became enemies overnight, old grudges ignited. Arthur had no choice. He could not let the deaths go unanswered. He had to pursue Lancelot, to punish the defiance, to restore what little order remained. And so Arthur prepared to leave. But Camelot could not go leaderless in his absence. Someone had to rule while the king waged war abroad. And in the tangle of politics and grief, there was only one name left that made sense: Mordred. He had been loyal. He had exposed the affair. He had protected the court's honor. And he was blood, Arthur's own kin. So the king handed him the crown, temporarily, just until justice had been served. Arthur left unaware that the match had already been struck, and behind him, Camelot smoldered, its people divided, its throne no longer as steady as it once seemed. And Mordred? He sat upon it, not as a knight, not as a steward, but as something far more dangerous, a man who had been handed power and was not about to give it back. Hey everyone, just a quick intermission here. I wanted to say thank you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Did you know that over 80% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed to the channel? If you've enjoyed this content so far, it would be incredible if you could hit that subscribe button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel grow and ensures that you won't miss any more of our fascinating stories we explore together. Also, if you're feeling generous, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share with anyone else who may enjoy it. Your support really does make a difference and keeps the content coming. Thanks again, and let's get back to the story. During the campaign against Lancelot, Guinevere was eventually retrieved and brought back to Camelot, but that did not stop Arthur's pursuit. When Arthur departed once more, it was with a heavy heart and a fractured court. The round table had splintered, trust had faltered, but the king still believed the realm would hold while he was away, that his own kin would safeguard it until he returned. He was wrong. Mordred had been handed power, crowned not as king but as regent, a placeholder to keep Camelot upright while Arthur righted the wrongs caused by betrayal. But Mordred didn't see himself as a placeholder. He sat in Arthur's throne like it was made for him, held counsel as if the crown belonged on his brow, and the moment Arthur's sails vanished over the horizon, Mordred's reign truly began. At first, he played the part well. There were no loud declarations, no sweeping changes. His voice in court remained measured, his judgment calm. He smiled in the right places, showed respect to the old lords, and called upon Arthur's name as if he still acted on the king's behalf. But power, once tasted, is never held lightly. Mordred began laying foundations, quiet ones. He started gathering allies, not openly, not with fanfare, but with promises made in candlelit rooms and hallways far from the throne. Disgraced nobles found themselves pardoned. Discontent knights were suddenly granted command. Small favors, seemingly harmless, began stacking into something larger, something harder to deny. He spoke to the people differently than Arthur had. Less about unity, more about justice. Less about ideals, more about survival. He whispered that Camelot had grown too soft under the weight of old traditions, that what the realm needed was clarity, a firm hand, and many agreed. There were peasants who welcomed the change, taxes eased, sentences shortened. For them, Mordred was not a tyrant, but a reformer, a man who saw their burdens and acted. They didn't see the shadows gathering behind the throne, or the quiet threats made against those who spoke out. All they saw was a ruler who made things happen. Behind the scenes, the court grew colder. Nobles who questioned Mordred's growing influence found themselves silenced, sometimes through exile, sometimes through more permanent means. He began rewarding loyalty with land, with titles, with whispers of what might come if he were king in truth, not just in name. And then came the rumors that Arthur had died abroad, that the war with Lancelot had claimed the king, that the realm could not afford to wait for a ghost to return. Mordred did not confirm these whispers. He didn't have to. Soon messages were sent, missives to neighboring kingdoms, to lords on the fringes of the realm, letters that did not speak as a regent, but as a sovereign, as a king. And somewhere in a fortified tower, Queen Guinevere locked herself behind stone walls. She had fled the court, refusing Mordred's offer of marriage, an offer that would have sealed his claim to the throne, tied him to the queen, and erased the need for further justification. She knew what he was becoming, and she wanted no part of it. Still, Mordred pressed on. He held feasts. He granted pardons. He knighted young men hungry for purpose and loyalty. He called councils where Arthur's name was no longer spoken with reverence, but with discomfort. The old king, some whispered, belonged to a different time, a better time perhaps, but a time that had passed. And so the weight of kingship crept around Mordred's shoulders, not all at once, but piece by piece. A title unspoken, yet understood. The crown was no longer waiting for him. It was already there. And across the sea, Arthur, still breathing, still grieving, was about to find out what had been built in his absence. Arthur had left his kingdom in mourning. He sailed not just to punish Lancelot, but to escape the ache that now haunted the walls of Camelot. His wife's betrayal, his friend's treason, the unraveling of everything he'd spent his life trying to build. But even as he waged war across the sea, something gnawed at him. Letters reached his hands, carried across turbulent waters by messengers whose eyes held more fear than loyalty. These weren't battle reports. They weren't news from trusted knights. These were warnings. Camelot had changed. The first letters were vague, whispers of odd behavior, quiet shifts in loyalty, Mordred growing more confident in court. But each message that followed was louder, more desperate. Mordred had begun acting like king, holding court with the crown on his brow, making decisions that no regent had the right to make, redistributing land, forging alliances, speaking as if Arthur were already dead. And worse still, they spoke of Guinevere. Word reached Arthur that his queen, already stained by scandal, had fled the capital. She had taken refuge in the Tower of London, barricading herself behind stone and oath, refusing to let Mordred anywhere near her. Rumors swirled that Mordred had declared his intent to marry her, that he would take Arthur's queen and Arthur's crown in one move. That was the final blow. Arthur broke off the campaign against Lancelot, just like that. His old friend, the man he had once loved like a brother, was no longer the most urgent matter. The weight of betrayal had shifted. It was no longer about love. It was about legacy, about survival. Arthur gathered what forces remained and ordered the fleet to set sail. He returned to a kingdom he barely recognized. Camelot, the shining heart of his realm, now wore a new face. His banner still flew, but it was tattered, faded. Many of the nobles he had trusted were gone. dead, exiled, or quietly serving another master. Mordred had not simply held power, he had filled every room with his presence. Every hall echoed with his name. The people still remembered Arthur, but Mordred was the one they now feared, and in some cases, admired. Arthur didn't ride back in triumph. He came ashore like a ghost, dragging behind him the weight of war and heartbreak. His loyalists rallied to him, knights who had stayed true, families who had held out hope. But their numbers were small and their morale strained. They had fought too many wars, lost too many friends, and now they had to fight again. This time not for glory, not for expansion, not even for peace, but to reclaim what was supposed to be safe. Arthur knew that this battle would be different. He wasn't riding out to face an invader from a foreign land. He was going to war with his own blood. A man who knew the layout of his halls, who understood the rhythm of his rule, who had grown up in the shadows of his court and now claimed to rule it better. There would be no diplomacy, no peace talks. Mordred had drawn the line the moment he claimed the throne, and Arthur, king or not, could not let it stand. The war for Camelot had begun, and it would end where all things must, on a field soaked in blood. Camlann was never meant to be remembered. It wasn't a sacred site or a hallowed field. It had no strategic significance, no grand fortifications, no noble name sung by bards. It was just a quiet stretch of land, open, windswept, and empty. But that was what made it perfect. There, under heavy skies and the weight of history, Arthur and Mordred would settle everything. Both armies knew what this meant. There would be no prisoners, no truce, no honorable retreat. The king had returned not to negotiate, but to reclaim his throne. And Mordred, having come so close to absolute power, would never give it up willingly. Arthur's forces were weathered, smaller than in the days of his youth, but loyal. These were the knights who had fought beside him through countless campaigns, who had watched Camelot rise from dream to reality. They were battle-hardened and battle-weary, but they still believed in the king who had once united Britain. Mordred's army was different. It was a patchwork of ambition, opportunism, and fear. Some of his knights were true believers, men who saw in him a new future, one less burdened by Arthur's code of honor. Others followed simply because he had power, and power attracts those hungry for it. And a few followed because they feared what would happen if they didn't. The night before the battle, the air hung heavy. It rained briefly, just enough to soak the earth, to turn the field into soft, unforgiving ground. Campfires burned low. There were no songs, no feasting, only silence and the quiet sounds of armor being checked, swords sharpened, and men praying, not for victory, but for peace, in whatever form it might come. Some say Arthur dreamt that night, that he saw Britain broken in two, that he saw knights lying dead beneath a sky without stars, that he woke with tears in his eyes and said nothing to anyone. And then morning came. The battle began, as many do, with chaos, confusion in the ranks, shouts and cries swallowed by the clash of steel. Horses screamed, men fell, friends turned into enemies, brothers were torn apart by politics and fate. The ideals of Camelot, the round table, the code of chivalry, meant nothing now. There was only survival. Arthur fought like the king of old, driving into enemy lines with Excalibur in hand. Every strike he made was deliberate, every movement fueled by something deeper than duty. Grief, rage, betrayal. This was not just a war. It was the death of a dream. Mordred, for his part, did not hide behind generals or command from the rear. He was in the thick of it, his dark armor soaked with blood, his sword finding targets with ruthless precision. He didn't fight like a usurper. He fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Hours passed, though time seemed meaningless. The sun barely broke through the clouds. By midday, the battlefield was littered with the dead. Gawain had already fallen days earlier in a prior skirmish, struck down in a failed attempt to stop the conflict before it began. Other familiar names followed. Knights who had once shared laughter at Arthur's table now lay lifeless in the mud, and still neither side yielded. Eventually, the armies were little more than remnants, broken shields, cracked helms, men too wounded to fight, too stubborn to die. And in the center of it all, the two men who had once shared blood stood facing each other. Arthur and Mordred, uncle and nephew, father and son, king and traitor. The noise of battle had died down. What remained on the field were the groans of the wounded, the crackling of fires, the occasional clash of steel where skirmishes hadn't quite burned themselves out. But for most it was over, except for two. Arthur stood among the ruin, shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his armor and the weight of everything else. His cloak was torn. His crown had long since fallen. Blood trickled from a gash near his ribs, and his sword arm trembled from exhaustion, and yet there was no retreat in him. Across from him stood Mordred, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. His own armor had been dented and splintered, streaked with blood that wasn't all from his enemies. His shield had been lost earlier in the fighting. All he had now was his blade, and the will to see this through. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. No apology could fix this. No justification could undo what had been done. Mordred had betrayed Arthur's trust, taken his kingdom, torn Camelot apart from the inside. And Arthur, in trying to preserve his realm, had brought it to ruin. This duel wasn't about winning, it was about ending. They came at each other with what strength they had left. Mordred moved fast, sharp, precise. His strikes aimed to kill, not to wound. Arthur was slower now, weighed down by blood loss and years of fighting, but his swings were deliberate. Every movement carried the weight of memory. They had trained in the same halls once, shared meals, sat at the same table. Now they fought like strangers. Their swords clashed, again and again, metal screaming against metal. Mud kicked up beneath their boots. Each time they pulled apart, it was only for a breath. Mordred landed a slash across Arthur's shoulder and the king staggered, but he didn't fall. Arthur retaliated with a blow that knocked Mordred to his knees, but he didn't stay down. Back and forth they went, like the war itself was funneling all its fury into these final minutes. Every cut, every bruise, every cracked bone, they took it without pause. Neither man cried out, neither man begged. And then came the moment. Mordred lunged forward with all the speed he had left, driving his sword deep into Arthur's body, just below the ribs, where the armor had split. It was a fatal strike, the kind that should have ended it. But Arthur didn't fall. With a roar, not of triumph, but of heartbreak, he stepped forward, forcing the blade deeper into his own flesh as he raised Excalibur. And then he brought it down. The legendary sword pierced Mordred's chest, driving straight through. Mordred gasped, his mouth opening in a soundless breath. His eyes, so sharp, so calculating, widened with something else entirely. Not fear, not even regret, just surprise. He stumbled back, pulled free of Arthur's sword, and collapsed to the ground. The mud took him. The sky offered no answer. He didn't speak. He didn't curse. He just died. Arthur dropped to his knees beside him, blood soaking the earth. Around them, the wind stirred the broken banners of both armies. There were no cheers, no final charge, no one left to bear witness except a handful of dying men and the silence of a kingdom falling apart. Mordred's story ended where it always had to, not with glory, not with honor, but with a broken sword, a fallen king, and the last breath of a man who had reached for power and found only ruin.